As a child, I had tried to emulate the spirited abandon of a running horse. Head up and feet coming down with a thundering certainty. I ran and jumped and fought and wrestled and climbed trees as a youngster. Because it was as natural for an Indian child to do those things as it was to eat and sleep.
Jim was born into poverty in Oklahoma in a small cabin in 1887. It's said that the night he was born, there was lightning striking on the river nearby.
He was given the name Watohuk, which means bright path or path lit by lightning. And I mean, it's pretty fitting, right? He went on to shock the world.
He was born on the Sac and Fox Reservation. Growing up on the reservation, he liked challenging his own body, even as a little boy. Whether it was swimming in the North Canadian River, or it was chasing rabbits and catching them, it was catching wild horses, it was running over fences. And later, people would comment that that was like a natural cross-training.
The open plains and the river bottoms were my first track field. It was on them that I learned to run as a child.
But the reservation existed really only for 2 or 3 more years.
Before Europeans arrived in this country, there were millions of native peoples already here. By the time of Jim Thorpe's birth, there were fewer than 300,000 left.
In the years leading up to Thorpe's birth, the United States' relentless westward expansion fueled the Lakota Sioux Wars, as the nation encroached on indigenous lands and forced tribes onto reservations.
Indian reservations were really prison camps, and they were only supposed to be around for 25 years. And at the end of 25 years, we would have all been assimilated or dead.
In 1887, Senator Henry Dawes introduced a bill known as the Dawes Act, also known as the Allotment Act. It sought to take away what the government considered excess Indian land.
There are old accounts and images of Indian land for sale or free Indian land.
And so in order to get that land, they organized the famous Oklahoma land runs. Imagine what that was like, particularly for a 3-4-year-old child like Jim Thorpe. You had this place that you were born into, and overnight it's overrun by these strange white people.
They were looking at Native people as savages to be killed and forcibly removed through any means.
It's amazing that these communities survived. Even more stunning is that an athlete could emerge from those kind of circumstances.
Indian territory of Oklahoma was the Wild West in every possible way. Jim Thorpe's father, Hiram, represented that.
My father was Hiram Philip Thorpe, 1/2 Sac and Fox Indian and 1/2 Irish. He was a giant of a man.
Hiram would take his sons out into the rural land for days at a time and hunt and fish. But Hiram was also incredibly rough on them. When Jim was 4, Hiram saw him dog paddling along the edge of the North Canadian River and threw the little guy out into the current to see how his son made it back.
It was 40 yards to the bank, and it looked like a mile to me. But I made it under the watchful eye of my father. He said, "Don't be afraid of the water, son, and it won't be afraid of you."
It encapsulates what Hiram was like. So Jim grew up with that kind of father.
His father taught him and instilled in him at a very young age, to be a man, you had to step up, you had to compete.
Native people, we love competition.
So there would be running contests. There would be swimming contests. There would be jumping contests.
You know, we invented so many sports that people know in European culture or American culture, whether it's soccer, lacrosse, or even the game of basketball.
Jim Thorpe's love of athletic endeavors started in the Sac and Fox territory.
For Jim Thorpe, sports are in his blood.
My mother always looked upon me as a reincarnation of Black Hawk, the Indian chief for whom the Black Hawk War was named.
Black Hawk was this larger-than-life, heroic figure that every Indian boy in that tribe wanted to model himself on.
He fought against Andrew Jackson, Everyone in America knew Black Hawk's name. That's how impressive Black Hawk was.
So much so that his name was appropriated for a World War I Army division, the Black Hawk helicopter, and for the Chicago NHL team.
The Dawes Act didn't just divide up native land to be given to white settlers.
The other portion of the Dawes Act was meant to take Indian children and put them in boarding schools far from their homes.
Bureau of Indian Affairs mandated that the children should go at a certain age off to Indian boarding schools.
Sometimes it was voluntary. Parents would send their kids there thinking it was the only way to ensure their survival. Other times it was by force. The United States, they would kidnap these kids and they would force them into these establishments.
And the notion was to take the children of those warriors from the Lakota Sioux and tame them, quote unquote.
The boarding school era was meant to take children away from their native communities and teach them the Western way of life.
They were really all about assimilation. Kids were stripped of their humanity and of their culture.
They were put into uniforms. If they didn't already have an Anglo name like Jim, he was born with one, they were assigned them.
You can actually see pictures of students who went in native with long hair, with their earrings, with native dress. And then you see another picture of them with their short hair, looking very somber.
It was all a way to make them look white and act white and eventually be white.
It was a full-on attempt to reshape an entire generation of Native people.
Jim Thorpe endured 3 different boarding schools. First, he went to the Sac and Fox boarding school nearby, which he hated and ran away from twice.
I tired of the classroom routine and ran away, walking back home 23 miles. My father met me at the door and marched me back to school.
He kept doing that, running home, and finally Hiram said, "I'm going to send you so far away, you will never be able to come back."
Then he was sent to the Haskell Institute in Kansas.
It was at Haskell I saw my first football game and developed a love for it, a love I've had through the years.
And finally ended up at the flagship U.S. government boarding school.
On February 4th, 1904, I entered the Carlisle Indian School at Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
Well, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School was founded right after the wars of the Lakota Sioux out in the plains. It had the motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man."
And this is where he came of age in a lot of ways and where he began his career in sports.
The football team in particular was the reason that anybody knew Carlisle. When the Carlisle Indians, this exotic team of native people, would go play, they would draw a huge crowd.
The founder of Carlisle was Richard Pratt. He had been an officer in the far west during the so-called Indian Wars.
He's interested in assimilation for the indigenous people, but he also believes they have to prove themselves. And one of the ways they can prove to whites that they're worthy is through sports.
Jim loved football, and by the time he got to Carlisle, he wanted to play.
As much as Jim wanted to play football, he was too short and slight.
About 3 months after my arrival, I weighed 116 pounds, and I was 5 foot 3 inches in height.
He was a scrawny young guy.
Football was played at the highest level of collegiate hierarchy, which is Yale and Harvard. Football was important to them. It was the game that was going to teach the leaders of tomorrow how to lead, how to be strategic, how to be smart.
In lieu of a real war, we're going to put them out on this field to turn boys into men.
I've always felt that football was pretty closely related to warfare. I mean, violence is certainly a part of man, so why not admit it? Use it. Let it out.
Football was a game of brute force. Think of 2 semis just crashing straight into one another.
It's a collision sport. It's a violent sport. Every play is an act of violence.
American football was dominated by the famous so-called flying wedge.
The offense would mass behind a lead player and, based on models of warfare, would charge through the opposing line.
It took steamroller tactics to move the pigskin towards the opposing team's goalposts.
president of Harvard was calling for football to be abolished.
There was definitely public pressure. There were op-eds written.
The Chicago Tribune did a series about the number of deaths and injuries, and it read like an after-action report from Vietnam, listing all of these dead halfbacks and linemen.
And so this was not a tenable situation. As popular as it was becoming, you couldn't have people dying.
Teddy Roosevelt was president, and he was a Harvard man, and he loved football. So he called a conference in the White House of the leaders of these top schools and said, you've got to make football safer. You couldn't have our Ivy League leaders of tomorrow getting killed on the football field.
It was this close to kind of being out of here, which is wild to think of when you think about how important it's become in our American sports culture. At the end of the 1904 term, Jim decided to leave Carlisle and to work in their outing program, which was a kind of placement program where Indian kids would work as farmers or cooks or maids. It was also seen as a form of introduction into white society.
I was anxious to go for the experience. I did all the housework and learned to sew and cook. I longed to be out in the open again. I felt smothered with the indoor work.
So he goes on to work as a farmhand for 2 years, laboring in the field and breaking wild horses just like his father taught him.
Breaking horses is incredibly physical work. You're using your arms, you're using your hands, you're using your legs to jump up, to corral the horses. You're hanging on for dear life.
By the end of the summer, Jim's body had changed dramatically.
When Jim returned to Carlisle, he was primed, he was ready.
And it was then that the origin story of Jim Thorpe, the athlete, began.
What is wonderful about reflecting on Jim Thorpe's legacy is that you start to hear all these stories that sound like, somebody make that up? Did that really actually happen? And one of the more famous ones is the high jump story.
At Carlisle, one day he was in overalls, walking toward the athletic fields, saw members of the track team at the high jump pit.
Jim had no idea what the high jump was. He had never seen it before.
For several minutes, they successfully went higher and higher. Eventually, they placed the bar at a point they couldn't scale.
He watched boy after boy fail to make it over the bar. Intrigued, Jim walks over, and in his overhauls, Jim decided to give it a try.
If you know anything about Olympic sports, if you've seen this, it's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do.
Jim Thorpe had no experience, no training. He certainly didn't have the proper attire or footwear.
In just one graceful move, he runs up, leaps into the air, easily clears the bar. The boys were stunned.
Jim Thorpe made everything look effortless. Things that take people years and years and years of training, of coaching to do, he could do just like that.
For the fun of it, I ran and jumped the bar, turned around and laughed.
Jim just walked away as if it was no big deal. When this story reaches Pop Warner, he said Jim Thorpe just set the school record.
Pop Warner, who was the track coach, brought Thorpe into his office the next day and said, here's your uniform, you're on the track team.
But Jim really wasn't interested in track and field. He wanted to play football really badly.
And so when he introduced the idea of wanting to play football to Pop Warner, he thought, why would I ever let you do this? Because have you seen what happens on a football field?
But Jim was persistent. He would constantly, every day, ask Pop, when is it going to be my turn? When am I going to have a chance to play football?
I kept after him until he finally threw a suit to me, hoping to get rid of me, I guess.
There was this exercise where Warner would set up players every 10 yards all the way down the field and have somebody try to run through without getting tackled. And nobody could ever do it.
Jim is looking at 40 players, and their sole objective is to tackle Thorpe.
The only experience I've ever had with the football was at high school, if that could be called experience. My hand had never gripped a real football.
Warner figured these players were going to show Jim what football was all about. Thorpe takes off. He cuts, he weaves, he dodges, he stiff arms. Warner's watching it, slack-jawed. What he just saw, that moment, was the birth of Jim Thorpe as a football player.
Jim Thorpe is now a member of the Carlisle football team. His dreams of playing collegiate football are closer than ever. But he's relegated to the backup squad.
In October of 1907, Jim got his big break when Carlisle played the University of Pennsylvania at Franklin Field in Philadelphia. Pop Warner put him in to replace an injured player, but it didn't go exactly according to plan.
When I was given the ball to carry in my first big game, I got excited and didn't follow my interference. The result was I crashed into a stone wall of opposition and was thrown for a loss.
Jim was not off to a great start, but if Jim Thorpe was confident in anything, it was that he wasn't going to let one bad play stop him.
The next time the ball was passed to me, I got away around the end and tore 75 yards to a touchdown, and Pop Warner soon decided I was there to stay.
Along came Mr. Pop Warner, one of football's most brilliant minds.
A lot of people have heard of Pop Warner football. It is associated with youth football all across America, but not many people know the man behind it.
All these Pop Warner leaks, that comes from Pop Warner, the coach.
Pop Warner was not a pop. He didn't have any kids. He played football at Cornell. He was older than some of the other players, so they started calling him Pop. But Pop Warner was a brilliant football coach.
By 1908, under Pop's guidance, Jim is beginning to make a name for himself.
By the time Carlisle was scheduled to play University of Pennsylvania in October, Jim Thorpe had created an identity of toughness. So he came into that game with a target on his back.
Word passed through the Penn 11 to get Thorpe, put him out of the game. They did everything in the world to cripple me, but they didn't take into consideration the tough hide and the stubborn constitution of the prairie Indian.
Well, you think about it, you're an Indian kid in a boarding school, you've been taken away from your parents violently. For young Indian kids, you really don't have a chance to express that anger in any other way except through competitive sports.
In a fiercely contested game, Carlisle trails 6-0 in the final minutes, but Jim Thorpe refuses to back down.
In the real world, he could never really compete with white people. Playing football, he got to compete with them on an equal playing field.
I got the ball on a fast pass and was on my way skirting the end, carrying the mail 65 yards to a touchdown, tying the score. Penn had been doped to win, and our tie proved quite an upset.
With Jim's help, Carlisle goes on to a 10-2 record that year.